few years ago, I did a documentary for Croatian television in which I talked about what I was doing in the village, filming the village, and how I taught myself editing, and then how I later was becoming more demanding and wanted to write music, my own music, for the documentary films. And I mentioned this in the Croatian television documentary, but what I failed to mention was that I had taught myself through a series of videos which have been published by a man called Christopher Brelox, Dr. B as he is known. And this was an invaluable series of videos which really helped me to shape my understanding of composing music. And then gradually, I was becoming a bit more demanding of myself. I wanted to stretch myself further. And I got a music composing program which enabled me to create orchestral sounds. And I didn't really know much about music, so I studied musical theory, just like I did with studying film theory, how to edit films. So I studied musical theory so that I could then hear music in my head, or the music that I was hearing in my head, I could put down onto paper. And I followed his course for about a year, and I learnt a tremendous amount of material from him. A little while ago, I looked on his website and I saw that he was coming to Zagreb. He was giving a paper at an international saxophone conference, which I believe is his primary instrument. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to meet him, to show him the city, to take him round, have lunch with him, and just, meet him. And we did, and we spent a wonderful afternoon, and the memory of that remains really deeply embedded in me. He was such a nice, charming person to spend time with. And then a few months ago, he started doing live stream question and answers, helping people with their musical theory problems or issues. And I followed the live streams and I was really interested in what he was doing. And then a couple of weeks ago, he asked for submissions for a kind of jingle to introduce his live streams. And he said it needed to be short and to the point and include the words "Ask Dr. B about musical theory." So I thought, well, here is a challenge. I like a challenge. So I submitted a 9-second piece of music. And I was astonished that he chose it. My first submission didn't have singing, but he encouraged me to try singing the words, which I did. I'm a little ambiguous about it, but he's happy with it, happy enough to choose my entry. But what was so astonishing was that the weekend for his live stream, he gave over about 40 minutes to analyze my 9-second piece of music. And what was so wonderful for me was that I could recognize all the anomalies, the eccentricities, the breaking of the rules which I had clearly done. Which is not to say that one shouldn't break the rules, but for my level of musical understanding, I should steer away from that unless I can explain why I had included such an anomaly in the music. But it was so fascinating to watch that analysis. So for the rest of this video, and I appreciate it'll have a small audience for my audience, I want to acknowledge my gratitude to Dr. B and the wonderful work he does in helping people, such as myself, to develop a musical language for themselves and a greater understanding of musical theory. So Dr. B, if you see this, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So, welcome again to Dr. B Music Theory. I'm very excited about this particular video that I'm making right now because 2 weeks ago I announced a Dr. B Music Theory jingle writing contest, and the deadline was earlier today, and I'm happy to announce that the winner is Andrew Norris, who, for those of you who tune in regularly, will see him involved in the chats. He's watched these videos for a number of years and actually has used them to create his own music for documentary films that he makes. So he was born in England, grew up in England, and now spends a lot of his time living in Croatia and makes documentaries about kind of rural life in some of the smaller, less dense populated areas of Croatia. So he interviews people who've grown up in the same town, who sing traditional songs, and he's created his own background music and underscoring for these documentaries, and he's used Dr. B Music Theory to help him do that. So it's really awesome that he was able to submit something that really, I thought, did a great job of capturing what I wanted. And it was very interesting because he sent me two versions off the pretty quickly after I announced the contest. One was with kind of a string orchestra, and the other was a recorder and harpsichord version. Neither one of them had singing. They had the melody and everything, and he had sent a score that had it written out. And he basically said, "Oh, I'm just not a singer. So sorry, Dr. B." And I wrote back. I said, why don't you give it a shot? Why don't you just try and see what you come up with? Because that's really what I want. I want it with the words, because that's kind of what makes it fun and gives it what it's supposed to be trying to achieve. So he did it, and this is something I've mentioned a number of times in the videos, is that as musicians, we should all sing, we should all play piano, we should all play drums, some kind of thing to get us in touch with melody, with harmony, and with rhythm. So I'm really glad that he went a little bit outside of his comfort zone and he did something a little unusual, but I think it came out great. I love it. So I would like to play it for you right now. So this is Andrew Norris, the jingle for Dr. B Music Theory. This is it too. This is what he wrote, and we're going to analyze it after we listen to it. So let's listen to it right now.
Ask Dr. B about music theory.
All right, so that's it. And I just played it off of a phone next to my lav mic, so the audio quality is not is not going to be the best there, but you can certainly go, and I just posted it up on my YouTube channel earlier this afternoon. I posted it up on Patreon. I posted it on my Facebook pages and in the Facebook fan page. So you can go ahead and listen to it. I've turned it into exactly the kind of promo I was looking for. So I'm just gonna give me 1 second. So the beauty of it is it's doing exactly what I want. And this is something that's interesting for us who are studying music theory. Some of us I know are just trying to figure out how to pass a class. Some of us are trying to figure out how to do well on an entrance exam. But some of us are actually looking to be composers and arrangers. And this is where you have to learn how to take your knowledge and translate it into something that's going to be usable for a very specific thing. So if you look at what I posted, I took the audio, I combined it with a graphic that I had someone make up for me that says "Ask Dr. B about music theory," and then I put a little information at the end. Some of that information is going to be new to you, is because of daylight savings time and the days are ending a lot shorter. I'm going to move my regular Q&A. This is going to be the last one at 3 p.m. Eastern time for a while. I'm moving it back to 1 p.m. Eastern time. So 2 weeks from today, we're going to have another live Q&A, but it's going to be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time. That way that it's not completely dark by the time I get done with this. And I can still go outside and see some sunlight, which is always an enjoyable thing. So my point there is Andrew wrote a great jingle. It was short, to the point, nothing, just the right amount of fanciness and the right amount of simplicity, so that I could put a little 10-second thing that I can put up on Facebook and on my YouTube channel that says what I'm doing, and it announces the new time, and it's perfect. So Andrew, thank you, wonderful job. And I had some other really interesting runner-up submissions as well, so I really appreciate those of you who submitted something. That was awesome. So let's dive in and take a look and see what let's analyze what Andrew did, okay? So I'm going to get out, let's see here, I'm going to use this here. So he chose the key. We got two sharps. It starts on a D major triad. It ends on a D major triad. We are clearly in the key of D major. So we label that D, D, F sharp, A. That is clearly a 1 chord in our key of D major. So I'm going to go ahead and write lead sheet symbols as well. And Andrew immediately makes things interesting because if we go to this next chord, we got F sharp, E, A, D. Now that does not make up a triad or a 7th chord. There's a non-chord tone involved here. So immediately giving us a little something special here. So what is it most closely to? Well, since there's 2 different notes here in this beat, chances are that one of them is the non-chord tone. Well, if the D is the non-chord tone, and we look at F sharp, A, C sharp, E, that creates a 3-7 chord, an F sharp minor 7 chord, which would be a 3-7 with this D as a non-chord tone. What kind of non-chord tone? We're going to label that as what it is, which is an appoggiatura, so APP. An appoggiatura, again, you leap and then step back in the opposite direction. So the appoggiaturas normally land on a strong beat. So it's landing clearly on beat 2. We're already establishing a harmonic rhythm of quarter notes. So this is textbook appoggiatura. So textbook. Now, don't worry, those of you who are afraid that you're not going to have any unexpected things that are difficult to analyze. He does do some unusual things that are not textbook. And we're going to talk about all of those. So what happens next? We then go to G, D, G, B. Well, that's at least a textbook 4 chord. And we know that 3 often goes to 4. 3 as in terms of harmonic progression will either go to 6 or 4 most commonly. So harmonic progression, exactly textbook. And if we look here at this F sharp in the bass, that is a non-chord tone. You could call it the 7th, but the harmonic rhythm doesn't really support calling that a 7th chord, but it does support calling it a passing tone. So we have a passing tone in the bass. Again, these non-chord tones are often really help propel the music, make it a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more interesting. So speaking of interesting, let's look at beat 4, because this is where it really does start to diverge from the more traditional aspects. We have E, C sharp, E, A. So that is a major triad with E in the bass. So we would call that, let me do this nice and neatly, 5, 6, 4. Now, for those of you who remember my videos on 6/4 chords, second inversion triads, they have very specific rules on how you're supposed to use them. You either are supposed to use it as a passing 6/4, a neighbor 6/4, which some people also call a pedal, or a cadential 6/4. You are not supposed to use second inversion triads in other ways. Or let me rephrase that. It's not that you're not supposed to, it's that it's not normal that you're going to use a second inversion triad in any other way than these 3 options here. And the reason for that is because second inversion is so unstable that it can very easily sound like a chord that it's not. So if you were to say E, A, C sharp, is that really an E major triad? So let me do it like this, right? Is that really an E major triad with a suspension, an A being suspended? And let me rewrite this so it's a little clearer. I would like to do the A here and the C sharp here. Are these A and C sharps, are these suspensions where the C sharp's going to go to a B and the A is going to go to a G sharp? And then what we're really talking about is an E major triad, and that what appears to be a second inversion A major triad is really just these little two parts suspended above a root position triad. The power of that bass being so fundamental and the instability of the second inversion triad being so unstable that it really wants to go somewhere. And this is essentially the whole crux of what a cadential 6/4 is. And so part of the reason the second inversion triads have these fairly strict rules on how you're supposed to use them is because of that instability and how it doesn't necessarily sound like a one chord. A cadential 6/4 doesn't really sound like a tonic triad in second inversion going to a 5 chord. It sounds a bit more like a 5 chord that has these two notes suspended above it that then resolve. So with that in mind, we're going to say, well, what kind of 6/4 chord is this? And it doesn't really easily fit into one of these options. It kind of fits, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But if we keep analyzing, we would then say that this D is a passing tone in the bass, that we have a D here in the tenor, and that looks like it steps up and then leaps down. So that would be an escape tone. The E maintains. Then we have a B up here. This steps up and then leaps. So just like this, the C sharp and the A, these create the interval of a 6. And we know that parallel 6s are just really effective in music. So this parallel 6, two kind of like escape tones that kind of move against a passing tone, which happens to create an octave with this. So one of the things to keep in mind is when you do write more than one non-chord tone at the same time, they need to relate to each other in a somewhat consonant manner most of the time. There are exceptions, but you'll notice that what Andrew did here is that he said, okay, I'm going to do the C sharp and this A. We get what you get that. It steps up to the non-chord tone, then leaps down into the resolution, quote unquote resolution, because it gets more sophisticated here, but that's the general shape of what we're expected. But it creates consonances amongst the multiple non-chord tones. So when you start off working and learning non-chord tones, I recommend you only do one non-chord tone at a time, because it's easier as you're learning the fundamentals. But as you get those fundamentals down pat, then you can do things like this, where you're writing multiple non-chord tones at the same time, but they create consonances amongst themselves. So it's almost like you could analyze that and a 4. You could try to analyze it as a chord. It would be tricky because you got the E in here, and you don't do that because the harmonic rhythm has already been established as the quarter note. So we know that analyzing the and a 4 doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. The only exception for that would be if the progression itself warrants having that analysis. So meaning if we had a chord here and a chord here, like let's say a chord on beat 4 that made sense, a chord on beat 1 where you're like, well, it doesn't make sense for that chord on beat 4 to go to that other chord on beat 1 unless you analyze that upbeat. And in that case, you sometimes will. This is not one of those cases. So let's keep moving forward. We look here, we got C sharp, A, E, F sharp. And I'm like, well, what can we make of this? Well, we got a couple options. We got a couple options on that one. We could, and let me jot down those notes, right? We could say F sharp, A, C sharp, E. And we have another 3/7 chord, but this time in an inversion. So that's one option, right? Another option, let me erase this part here, is to say, well, what do we have? What do we have if we look at that upbeat? Well, we have B, A, D, G. Well, that doesn't create any kind of, that would definitely mean that there's a non-chord tone in there. So I think that we're essentially going to go with that, and I think that makes sense. Again, having 3 in inversion is a little bit unusual, and having this 5/6/4 chord not easily fall into one of these three options is something we're going to have to discuss. But if we look at it and we say, okay, that's a 3 chord, and it's in second inversion, so we would say F sharp minor 7 with C sharp in the bass. What that would mean is that we have another passing tone here on the and we know that Bach does this a lot, where you'll have this descending scale with the passing tones, and it's this descending scale is the hint on why this somewhat unusual second inversion 5-6-4 chord going to the 3-4-3, why it works. It's that power of the scale. A descending scale has such goal-oriented momentum that if you can harmonize something and make it vertically line up as something consonant, your ear is going to say, yeah, okay, maybe it's not the way I would expect to hear a second inversion triad or necessarily a certain progression, but the ear translates it and says, well, that works. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. You could then say that this is also a passing tone right here. So we got the passing tone B. We got another passing tone here. And then a passing tone in the soprano. So you have all the passing tones happening on the and to keep, again, and passing tones help keep that momentum going. If we look at it, we have B and D and G sharp and G natural. So this is like a G major triad on the and of 1. So remember how I said a moment ago that if you're going to have multiple non-chord tones happening at the same time, that they should create their own chord. So it does. This is like a G major triad, but then you'd say, well, there is an A that keeps going right here, this A in the tenor. So you don't necessarily do that as a Roman numeral analysis. The idea behind a Roman numeral analysis is to try to indicate the function and how things are working. So let's keep going. And maybe we can get some more insight into how things are working. Here we have A, F sharp, C sharp, A. Well, that is an F sharp minor triad with A in the bass. So a 3 chord in first inversion. And many of you who've watched my videos will say, Dr. B, didn't you say that both 3 and 6 should only occur in root position? And the answer is yes. That is absolutely what the norm is. And in part because when you put a 3 chord in first inversion, it can almost sound like a 5 chord. This F sharp sounds like it could go down to it. This F sharp feels like it could just move down to an E, and all of a sudden we'd have a 5 chord, because A, C sharp, A, if we just move this F sharp down to an E, it would sound like a 5 chord. So one of the reasons it's so rare to find 3 in first inversion is because it's so similar to sounding like a 5 chord. So if we go, that's a 3-6 chord, right? Now it's a 5 chord. So if I go 1, 4, 3, 6, 5, right? It doesn't really sound like a 3 chord like we normally would, because that A in the bass is so powerful. It screams dominant. It screams a 5 chord. So it's almost as if you're saying a disguised 5 chord. But in this case, it's a little trickier because we actually had a 3-4-3, we had a 3-7 here. So there's a big emphasis in what Andrew wrote on the 3 chord. So this 3 chord is forming a very important part of this piece. So let's keep analyzing. If we go to beat 3, we got G, B, C sharp continues, right? This is a mistake that sometimes you might make when you're analyzing a piece, especially on a test or an exam, or even just analyzing a score, is you'll just look here and you'll say, well, I just see G, B, and D. It's a 4 chord, nothing special. And forget about the note that's being sustained. But I think it is a 4 chord in essence, and this C sharp is being held over, and if we look at where it's going to resolve, it resolves up. So that is called, right here, would be the C sharp starts off as a chord tone. It gets sustained, so when you get right here, it becomes a retardation, R-E-T. Means it's going to resolve up by step. Now, it becomes a little trickier than that because the chord changes on beat 4, and we're going to call this a 4 chord. It changes on beat 4 so that it's not resolving into that 4 chord as we would expect. So we have this A in the bass, the B sustains, we have the D sustaining, the C sharp is still there. So if I were to just look at those notes, I would say I've got G, I'm sorry, I'm on beat 4. I've got A in the bass, I've got a C sharp that's still being sustained in the alto, I've got a B, and I've got a D. Well, A, B, C, D, it's like it's a scale spread out. So if you look at it like that, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So what we have to do in a situation like this is we have to remember that the bass note is so fundamental for creating what we expect in terms of harmony. And so when we hear as a bass line, and we look where it's going, it sounds so like sol, do, 5, 1. So even though the upper voices don't clearly outline or indicate a 5 chord, the power of that bass line down the scale to 5, 4, 5, 1, or scale degrees 5, 4, 5, 1, that alone is going to make our ears hear this as a dominant chord. So then the problem becomes, well, how do we make sense of these non-chord tones? So that means that the B turns from a chord tone into a non-chord tone. And there's a little something thematic here. Just like this C sharp turned into a non-chord tone, this B turns into a non-chord tone, and this D turns into a non-chord tone. So sometimes when you do something unusual, if you do it just once, it sounds like a mistake because the listener hears it, says, well, I didn't expect that. Was that just some random mistake? But if you repeat it, you can often, then it becomes clear, well, this is intentional. And then the brain, and again, this is all happening subconsciously in the listener's brain says, well, is there a method to the madness? And it starts to hear that, oh, we start something in chord, and then that sustains, and it turns to a non-chord tone. Ah, there is a method to the madness. And so that's what's happening here. So this B becomes a non-chord tone. And if you say, well, it's prepared by common tone, and then you have this, it becomes a non-chord tone. So it's kind of like a suspension, because it's going to resolve over here. And this is kind of like a lower neighbor. So I'm going to call this a suspension, and this a lower neighbor tone, because it's suspended above that. So it's kind of like chaining non-chord tones. So this is a pretty unusual little spot, but we can kind of make sense of that. This B is going to go to this A in terms of resolution, because when we get to here, just a little jumping ahead, this is definitely a 1 chord. This is very clearly so. With all with the high degree of uncertainty right here on beat 4, this is the most complicated part of the jingle. As soon as you have that most complex, he instantly resolves it by a very clear 1 chord. Not just any chord, a 1 chord. So when you're going to have that level of unexpected and uncertainty from a harmonic standpoint, you don't want that to last too long, and then you want to instantly resolve all those things so that the listener is like, oh, that was exciting because it was I was worried whether we were going to resolve, but it did. And so that sensibility is what is achieved here. So the B is prepared by common tone, and it's eventually going to resolve down by step. So it's like this neighbor tone is like an embellishment. It's like it delays the resolution of the suspension. And so this is also looks a little bit like a neighbor group, right? So B, which is a step above, G, a step below, it's like an unattached neighbor group. So again, if some of this terminology is going a little bit over your head, I've got my videos that talk about non-chord tones. Look those up. But this is a pretty complicated use of those. Let's take a look at what happens here. The C sharp that was that turned into a non-chord tone here and is eventually going to resolve to this D. But interestingly, as soon as it hits this beat 4, it becomes a chord tone. The shape still ends up resolving itself, but it's a really interesting thing that happens. So again, beat 3. So beat 2, the C sharp is a chord tone. Beat 3, it becomes a non-chord tone. Beat 4 becomes a chord tone. So actually, I'm gonna change my mind on this. It looks as a shape as that, but I'm actually gonna call this a pedal. I actually think that's a more accurate description because it's in the chord, it's not in the chord, it comes back and it's in the chord. So I'm gonna call that a pedal. And so what that means is that, and that's actually a better explanation. So this D here, this is a, you know, when all else fails, this one's prepared by step up and then leap in the same direction. That's no non-chord tone we typically see. So people will sometimes call that a free tone. Free tone. There's no rules. Just do whatever you want. It's a free tone. And then the question is like, well, why does that work? You know, does it work? How well does it work? Interestingly here, you get the two non-chord tones being a G, a D, which creates a fifth. That's usually not what you want in a non-chord tone relationship. You usually want a third or a sixth. And keep in mind then what happens here is it's chord tone, the D becomes a non-chord tone, and then it becomes a chord tone. So we have this same idea of it's like a pedal tone right here, right there. So it's an A major triad because of the A and the C sharp is what makes it happen. We don't get the fifth, but we know that we can leave the fifth out. We've got a pedal tone here. It imitates this. It's like Bach often will change suspension, so you'll have like chord, suspension, resolution, suspension, resolution, suspension, resolution. That's a typical thing. Here we have almost like a chain of pedal tones. So this is chord tone, pedal, resolve, pedal, resolve. So we almost have like these chained pedal tones, which is kind of cool. So let's keep moving and look what we have. So we got our one chord, and then we move here on beat 2. We have a D versus a C sharp. That's super dissonant. That's a major 7 interval. And so the question then becomes is this a D major 7 or is this a passing tone? I tend to think, I would say let's hold off on that and see where it's going. So if we go here, we get D, D, G, B. Well, that's a 4-6-4 chord. That's a pedal 6-4. So if you remember, I was talking about the, well, it's going to be a pedal 6-4 when we go here, which is a 1. But it's a little more complicated than that. So hold up for it. But that's essentially what we're talking about there. So here we have a very unusual passing 6-4. But it's essentially a passing 6-4 because of that descending scale in the bass. And here, this is a more traditional, though still, when we look at beat 4, a little bit unusual in terms of a pedal 6-4, which is kind of neat that we have that pedal concept because we have these pedal tones that are incorporated in the alto and the soprano just previously. So let's take a look. We're going to come back to this C sharp in a minute. So very clearly, this A in the alto is a passing tone. So very much clear passing tone. And then here we got the B and the D, which is from our G triad over D. And then we go back to this A. So in the tenor, it goes A, D, back to A. And this A does not fit in the 4-6-4 chord. But I would call that a non-chord tone, and I would call it an anticipation. It's anticipating that next chord. So I think we're still staying on this 4 chord here in terms of how it functions. That C sharp then becomes a passing tone as well. And then we have clearly a 1 chord, and that's the same thing here. So, looking back here, is that C sharp a passing tone or is it a major 7? Well, I think the question then always becomes a question of harmonic rhythm. Here, it's clear that we've been essentially moving in quarter notes. Essentially, 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4. This is kind of 2 versions of 3, 4, 5, 1. But here we're getting towards the end, the cadence. And the harmonic rhythm is slowing down right here. So we have this 1, 4, 6, 4, 1, 1. So I think because it's essentially a half note here, and it's kind of being elongated anyways, I think it's probably best to call that C sharp a passing tone. So that gives you a complete analysis of what we have here and some of the things that are occurring. Got some things that are unusual, you got a bunch of things that are expected, and it's that balance, it's that interplay between the expected and the unexpected that composers are often most interested in. If you don't have enough expected, you're gonna confuse your audience, it's gonna feel uncomfortable, it's not gonna make any sense. But by having some unexpected things, it keeps it kind of fresh and interesting. So I'm gonna play it for you very, very slowly here on the keyboard and kind of point out some of those things. So, right? So we start on our 1 chord, and then listen to how nice this sounds. Right? That leap up. That leap up is has such emotional richness to it, and a 3/7 chord. The beauty of that 7th chord going in immediately from triads. We immediately go from triads to a 7th chord with an appoggiatura to our 4 chord, which kind of brings us back into our more traditional area. Passing tone. 5, 6, 4, which is a bit unusual, right? Then we get that, I'm sorry. So we're at that 5, 6, 4 chord. And we're back to that 3/7 chord, but this time in inversion. And there's our 3/6 chord. And you could argue that the 3/4/3 is, you know, it almost sounds like that's the resolution. You know, so it almost sounds like that it could be a 4 chord here. And this is something you have to listen to it, and it's almost like it's got a little bit of built-in ambiguity. And ambiguity is usually a bad thing, but sometimes if it's just a little bit, it can make things very interesting. So what if this was not a 3/4/3? And again, I haven't analyzed this thoroughly ahead of time, so I'm kind of working it through on the spot with you. So I don't have the right answer immediately, but I'm just thinking it through here. What if instead of the 3/4/3, what if this was a 4 chord? I'm going to erase this part here to make room. What if it was really a 4 chord here? And that this C sharp is kind of an accented passing tone. The A, and see, it doesn't make as much sense. So if this was the case, the C sharp would be an accented passing tone. The A would be a free tone, which again is pretty unusual because we just leap into it and leap out. So that would be pretty unusual. This would be a suspension. The alto E would be a suspension, and this would be like an accented appoggiatura, so it would be chained. So, you know, the only reason I'm entertaining this is because the consonance of that G major triad is just so striking on the upbeat. So when we look at that, and it goes by very quickly, so I think I think my original analysis is probably the most accurate. Yeah, and so I do think that it sounds more like a 3-4-3, that it's an expansion of that 3 concept, but there is a little bit of ambiguity in the sense that it almost sounds like it could be a 4. And the same with the 3-6, there's a little bit of ambiguity of having that it almost could be a 5, in which case, we're going from 4, 5, 6, 4, 4, 5, 4. We kind of, there's at a certain level, we're going back and forth between a 4 and a 5 chord, which isn't an insane thing. It's kind of like, it's not a progression. It's like 4, 5, 4, 5. It's like a back and forth thing. But after our 3-6, we get to this, and my hands aren't big enough, so. And that C sharp staying, notice that we have a little bit of a spacing error. It's a little bit more than an octave. So it's a little bit stretched out there. But listen to how this then resolves when we have this. That's what we have on beat 4. And then we get this 5th on the and. And then everything's okay. And they get that plaintive, little hint of plaintive emotion there with that major 7 interval with the passing tone. And then we get the. All right, so we have a little bit of a spacing thing here. Unusual, little spacing thing here. Unusual. And it begs the question, is like, well, would it have been better if that wasn't there? Or does this kind of unique, this little departure, momentary departure, kind of give it a quirky quality that makes it unique and special? And so I think those are the questions that you'll be asking yourself as a composer and as you're making things. And very often when you're studying music, a good teacher won't necessarily tell you, oh, this is wrong, this is right. They'll say, well, is this the effect that you wanted? Was that a conscious decision, or was that something unconscious? And if it was unconscious, are you sure? And so all in all, I think this is a wonderful, wonderful jingle. I love it. Thank you again, Andrew. I'm going to now go to the chat because I'm sure we're going to have some questions maybe related to this, but we're now opening the Q&A up to any questions because we always talk about a wide range of topics. So let's take a look here. Andrew is here which is awesome. So pleased you liked it, and thanks for encouraging me to try singing. Absolutely, Andrew. It's like, your singing is good. I mean, it's you're not Pavarotti, but that's not what this kind of thing requires. You're not going to get booked to sing the next leading role in a Puccini aria. But is this something that will work for a short 10-second jingle? Your voice sounds great. It's rich. You sing in tune. It's awesome. So I'm glad you did it. Andrew is saying this analysis is so interesting. There's so much I hadn't considered. Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like. That's the job that if you were taking like composition lessons, the composition teacher would say, oh, I find this is interesting. This is interesting. Have you thought about this? And those questions are what then inform the next time around that you're composing something. You're like, let me be aware of as much as possible of what I'm doing when I'm composing a piece. This is not to say that you can't compose awesome music without you don't have to be aware of everything to compose something awesome. That's not necessary. It's just that it helps, especially as you start to write longer pieces and in terms of consistency. So if we think about the great composers in the past, someone like Franz Joseph Haydn, who wrote hundreds of symphonies and string quartets. Like for him to consistently be able to write a piece that sounded good, he had to have a certain level of awareness that might be a little bit more than is necessary to just get something good. I'm not saying Andrew Norris is a one-hit wonder, but we know, we've heard in pop music, there's groups that write a hit, it works, it's really great, but that's it. They never can reproduce it. And that's because at a subconscious level, they stumbled upon something that was very effective. But it was at a subconscious level, and it never became to the conscious level, so they just weren't able to reproduce that or do it again. They were not able to consistently generate songs or compositions that had that same effectiveness. So Andrew, I'm glad it was helpful, and I will be sending you an email, because as the winner, you get a 30-minute Q&A. We can go do on the phone or Zoom or whatever, and you can ask me any questions you want about music or composition or whatever else. But I'll be contacting you to set that up. Andrew was saying, I based the notes on the first letter of each word where possible. A, D, B, A. Ask Dr. B about. Oh, that's so neat. Ask Dr. B about. No, there's no F. That's so neat. Ask Dr. B. I love those games. See, this is one of those things that composers do sometimes. So like when they're doing like canons, or Bach writes something based on his name and stuff. You know, this is like the little mental puzzles that composers often set for themselves, and it's just something to get the juices flowing. You know, it's you know, and this is kind of that idea of the marriage between inspiration and craftsmanship, where you need some level of inspiration and some level of craftsmanship. And sometimes you have these like little puzzles that help you with that craftsmanship area to get the inspirational juices flowing. I like that. That's a neat little, I didn't catch that.